Mike, welcome to Leadership Conversations. How are you?
Great. Thanks, Bradley.
Wonderful. Really appreciate you putting the time aside to come in and actually have a sit-down conversation with me today.
Yeah, it's great being able to do face-to-face sits down again after the last couple of years.
It has been a while, hasn't it? We're going to have a chat today about what is great leadership from your perspective, and I know that you're really passionate about great leadership, but also we're going to touch on what it takes to really transform an organization's culture during times of change. But before we do that, I really wanted to touch on some of your wonderful personal achievements, and I'll maybe dial things back to 2017 when you were awarded CEO of the Year and also the Order of Australia. What did that mean for you personally?
Yeah, look, thank you. It was a real sort of pinch me moment on both of them because they're not things that you necessarily aspire to or think about along your career journey. And so when things like that come out of the blue and the work that you've done, whether it be in the corporate sense or in the community sense, is kind of recognised, it is lovely and it's an honour, particularly getting an Order of Australia. And, you know, for a little migrant kid who couldn't speak English when he first started school, literally couldn't speak a word of English, to sort of, you know, get awarded CEO of the Year award and particularly the Order of Australia and be part of us in that community was really special. And it was a real honour.
Wonderful.
Yeah, you know, it's because the leadership part from the CEO perspective allowed me to really talk about something that I'm quite passionate about in that year that I was the CEO of the Year, and talk about the importance of leadership and why I think it's important, which I know is some of the things that we're going to touch on as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Can I ask, what was it like growing up in the Ebeid family? Your parents must be really proud of all the things that you've achieved in your career.
Yeah, I mean, my family's very much a very typical migrant story. You know, mum and dad came to Australia in the late 60s. Dad was an engineer. And in those days, Australia needed engineers. And so he had a job pretty much before, you know, he landed in Australia, which is, I guess, you know, quite a lucky thing for a lot of migrants. And we started off life. Mum and dad wanted to, you know, give their kids a better life. They came from Cairo, Egypt. And there was a lot of issues back then, particularly for a Christian family in a Muslim country, and mum and dad, you know, wanted to sort of resettle in a Christian-based country, which was important for them. And that's what they did. And very much my whole sort of childhood, my mum worked, so I had two working parents. And I got to see my father, you know, really help mum out in a way that taught me the sense of equality in a family. So because mum and dad both worked, dad certainly was the furthest thing from a chauvinist in any way. And so traditional roles in my family didn't really exist. So dad helped out with everything from washing and ironing to washing dishes and cooking. And so that, I think, really did have an impact on me from a gender equality perspective, that the traditional roles of men and women in a household don't have to be that way.
Thanks for sharing that. You've had quite an incredible career, and I'm particularly keen to understand those formative years, going through IBM, then through to Optus, and then the ABC, and then taking on the CEO role at SBS, and then on to Telstra. What are you most proud of in your career?
I'm very proud of a bunch of things. You know, in those early days at IBM, it was a graduate position role. I'm going to really age myself here, but I was with IBM in the days when we launched the very first laptop and PC. You know, I joined Optus in an early stage when we launched the very first mobile phone, you know, dial-up internet. You know, I've been through a lot of major technology shifts that have changed the way we live and work. And I've been really excited to have played a role in some of that and been a part of it. But I think my time as CEO of SBS allowed me to really hone my own leadership skills, but also completely change an organization at its core in terms of its culture. And one of the things I'm really proud of was improving staff engagement from, a mid-40s to doubling that to the 80s. That was something that I was really proud of, because it kind of meant that a couple of thousand people were going home every day happier, working in a better environment, being their best selves at work, and being able to flourish in whatever profession they were in, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a marketer, whether you're a technologist, etc. I was really proud of that, and I'm sure we'll unpack some of that later.
Yeah.
And so that all of those things, I guess, have helped me be the sort of person and the leader that I am. And I, sort of think of them a little bit differently sometimes. But also on the personal front, once I had a little bit of a public profile after the SBS role, being able to use that to advance things like marriage equality was something that I was really proud of as well. And that gave you a bit of a platform to be able to have a voice in the community for social change. So things like that, I'm also very proud of.
It's actually a really good lead into the topic of culture. When you go into an organization and you recognize that, wow, there's actually some work to do around some of the things you touched on before, employee engagement is really low, employee morale is at an all-time low. How do you turn that around? And what are the fundamentals that you need to put in place to really drive that up to levels that you want them to be?
Yeah. Definitely at the beginning, you've got to have a passion and a will to want to change it. I think that's really important, because if it doesn't start at the top, it's very hard to get traction. If you don't have your CEOs, backing in changing things, and often I think culture does need to be led by the CEO and her or his team. And it really does have to start at the top. It can't just be something that is driven by, a HR department or a HR program. It really has to be something that the whole leadership team buys into. When I think about a culture in an organization, I often say to people that organizations have to actively work on what culture they want. What culture do they need to be successful in the sector that they're operating in? Because if you don't actively work on the culture that you want, the culture will develop around you, and it may not be the culture that you need to be successful in your organization. And so often when you ask a group of leaders, I get asked often to go in and sort of talk to C-level suite leadership teams about how do we start this journey, etc. And I think, well, you got to first know what sort of culture do you want, and then do a really forensic analysis of what sort of culture have you currently got, and you sort of build a bridge from A to B and say, okay, this is where we are, this is what our culture is. But you get your teams together to say, okay, what do we need? What sort of company do we have to have in terms of culture for us to be successful and achieve the goals that we want to achieve? And then how do you get from A to B?
Yeah.
And the how do you get from A to B is the list of initiatives, the programs that you're going to put in place to get there. And understanding right at the front, what is culture? I mean, we should probably just take a minute to talk about that, because, a lot of people find it a bit of a fuzzy thing. How do you just define what culture is? And I like to think of it as very tangible things. I mean, to me, culture is your systems and processes and behaviors within a company. So, behaviors is an easy one to define, whether you respect your employees, your customers, each other, etc. The way you behave is an easy one. But your systems and processes add a lot to culture. So if your processes are very bureaucratic, by definition, that's going to create a very bureaucratic environment. But if your processes have high levels of trust with your teams and allow people to take responsibility and make decisions, and you trust people, then by definition, those processes are going to create a very different sort of culture. And then, of course, your systems, your things like your expenses and how you reimburse and how you get approvals and all of that. So for me, all those things together contribute to a company's culture, your systems, processes, and your behaviors.
And do you feel that being your authentic self is really important to really lift that culture to the next level?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, a lot's been written in management books about being your authentic self. People
100%.
know when you're not being authentic. People know when you're, trying to be somebody else. And I often say to young leaders, don't try and be anybody else. You've just got to be yourself. Because for some people, leadership comes naturally. For other people, you've got to really work on it, and that's fine, but you've got to be yourself. And, I think leadership isn't that hard at the end of the day, but it's got to be purposeful and mindful in terms of what do you want to be? What do you want to achieve? What do you want your leadership brand to be? Often I say to leaders, well, what is your leadership brand?
Yeah.
And a lot of people look at you blankly. It's like, well, what do you want to be known for? And if you know what sort of leader you want to be in terms of your brand, understanding how people view you today is the next step. Because often, just like culture, the A to B journey that I gave, you've got to do the same thing with your leadership brand.
Yeah.
You can often think that you are an approachable leader, that you give people a fair hearing, et cetera, but actually if you survey your team, you might find out that actually you're perceived very differently.
Yeah.
And a good leader always gets feedback from their teams about how they're perceived, because I find that often leaders have a different perception of themselves to the harsh reality. And if you don't know what the harsh reality is, you can't change yourself as a good leader. And you've got to be able to constantly get feedback and say, well, actually, is that feedback in line with the sort of leader I want to be?
Yeah, absolutely. The listeners of this podcast, Mike, are CEOs, existing leaders, young leaders that have just moved into a leadership role for the first time. And when I talk to people on this podcast and my network, there's always this view that if you move into a leadership role, you need to be able to showcase to people a particular demeanor. It's surprising when people tell me that. There's this innate view that you need to be a very different person in the workplace than you are outside of work. But to your point, I think that not being authentic in the workplace, people can see through that.
Totally. Being really self-aware on the impact that you have on your team is really important. I think, so many leaders underestimate and undervalue the shadow that they cast on their team. If you're in a bad mood and you show it, your team generally knows it, and it affects everybody. It affects the whole team. How often do you see people say, oh, is the boss in a good or bad mood today?
Yeah.
People shouldn't have to worry about your moods. And back to your point on authenticity, one of the other really important reasons why you've got to be authentic is because it's then easier to be consistent. If you're trying to be somebody else, you'll end up being inconsistent because you'll go in and out of being your real self and this person or this persona that you're trying to be. And consistency is so important in leadership so that your team knows where they stand with you. Being aware of your team. And, one thing, of course, we all know is every team member is different. Some team members need high touch, high praise, high involvement, high instruction, and other team members just leave me alone. Just tell me what I've got to do. You don't need to pat me on the back. I don't need to be everyone's different. And as a good leader, you need to know how people want to be led. And when I start with a new team or have a new team member come into my team, I always say to people, how do you like to be led? How do you like to work with a leader? Because you can't assume that everybody wants to be managed and led the same way.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to switch gears. Do you need to be an extrovert to be a great leader?
Not at all. Really couldn't. I'm very clear on that. I don't think you do. There are times where you do need to be a bit of an extrovert and other times where you really need to be an introvert and sit back and listen. And so I find I go in and out of both. If I'm on stage, at, say, Telstra Vantage, I've got 3,500 people in an audience, I can't go on stage and be an introvert. I need to be a bit of an extrovert. I've got a job to do to present, to inspire, whether it's an internal audience or an external audience. But there are other times where in a meeting as a leader, you've got to zip up and actually use your ears a hell of a lot more than your mouth and listen to what's going on, what the messages are, or sometimes this, subliminal messages that people are trying to give you. And so going from one to the other is super important, I think, as a leader. Leaders, I think, who are constantly just extroverts and loud and talk more than they listen to aren't necessarily the good leaders.
I do agree with you on that. Yeah. And if I reflect on my own career, I've been working for 20 years now. I would say that the best leaders that I've come across in my career have a good blend of both.
Yeah. I mean, if you're trying to, particularly for a CEO, you have a lot of eyes in an organization, whether it's a small company or a major corporation. There's a lot of eyes looking at you. And everything you do is noticed, discussed, has an impact on somebody or everybody. And, that's where you've really got to think about, is this an opportunity for me to be a bit more of an extrovert, to inspire people? But I think you can also really inspire people by having more introvert sort of qualities as well. People who are quieter, who are very deep thinkers and strategists can be very inspiring because they may not talk a lot, but when they do talk, it's really inspired. Yeah. And so people don't need to be showy to be a good leader.
How's your leadership qualities evolved over 30, 35 years that you've been working? Are there any qualities that really stand out for you that you've had to kind of really work on?
Yeah, definitely. I'm a big believer that you need to evolve your leadership skills over time to suit organizations or teams or the environment. I mean, leaders in the last couple of years with COVID have had to completely change the way they lead. But just like we evolve our marketing techniques, we evolve our technology in businesses, we evolve every part of our company, so too, I think, does leadership need to evolve. So if I think about when I started in the workforce in, the mid-late 80s, it was very much command and control leadership. I'm the boss, I'll tell you what to do, and you just do it. You couldn't lead like that today. Today, leadership is all about coaching, inspiring, helping people grow, creating the right environments so people can be their best. Bosses 35 years ago would have told you, I don't need to know what your personal problems are, just get on with the job. And, there was no empathy. Leaders today, I think, have to have a high level of empathy. But to your question about, things that I've changed, I remember years ago when I was first, becoming a sort of junior manager and mid-level manager, one of the, when I talked earlier about often your team might have a different perception of you than what you think you are, I got some really stark feedback that I was a terrible listener. And I was like, really? I was really shocked. And often when you get 360 feedback, people are often surprised at various things in the feedback. And so I set out intentionally to really change that and to be a good listener. And it took a while, but then I was so proud a couple of years later when I started seeing on my 360s things like Mike's a good listener. I was like, wow, okay, it can work.
Tick.
Yeah. But I used to do physical things to remind myself. So every time I wanted to jump in and just give somebody the answer or interrupt, I would sit on my hands on my chair. And I would just not let my hands out from under my legs until the person stopped speaking. Wow. And it was just a little tiny physical thing.
But very effective, right?
That reminded me, just zip up and this is a time to listen.
Yeah.
But getting that feedback was invaluable for me as a leader. And I'm really fortunate that I got that feedback very early on in the process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've touched on a lot today, but could you perhaps summarize what is great leadership from your perspective? You've been a CEO before. What are those couple of things that really stand out for you when you go, wow, that person's a great leader? And I know it's something you're very passionate about.
I think, there's no one thing. I'd just say that.
Sure.
I think it's a handful of things. Being self-aware is incredibly important, and the impact that you have on others. I think a good leader is somebody who really spends time in thinking about building the right environment and the right culture so that their team can really be their best and give their best work, and for people to feel that they can put their ideas forward without being shot down or ridiculed, or, creating the right environment is really important, and working on the culture so that you can create that right environment. So what all that says to me is that actually leadership isn't about being the boss and making the decisions. For me, leadership is really about creating the environment so that your team can really shine and thrive in whatever industry and sector and whatever objectives you're trying to achieve. That to me is creating the right environment so that as a team you can really thrive.
Yeah. I remember something about you. You are an early riser. I'm keen to hear from you around the importance of self-care. How important is that, especially when you move into a leadership role and there's a lot going on? Every single day is different. You're dealing with different issues, problems, etc., etc. How important is self-care?
Critical. I have suffered from where I've been so busy and, exercising or going for a walk seemed like a unproductive use of my time. I've got so many things to do today. I don't have time to go to the gym or go for a walk or whatever, if you're a swimmer or a cyclist or whatever outlet you have. But it very quickly manifests into your mental health. It very quickly manifests into body problems. Many of us in the corporate world, very stagnant. We don't move. Our bodies aren't designed to sit for 12 hours a day. And so exercising, making sure you don't end up with bad backs and necks and all of the things that, modern day suffers from is really important. I had surgery on my neck about 5 years ago from constantly looking down at laptops.
Yeah.
Little things like that where my C6 and 7, it's kind of fused in my spine.
Wow.
Where now I make sure that I have a separate screen that sits up higher, that my eyelid, all those things are part of self-care. Going to the gym, even if you're exercising whilst on a call, but at least you're moving and taking time out is critically important. But also self-care in terms of just having fun with your friends and family is really important to keep it in check and keep it real. Somebody once told, and it was really good advice, I was going through a period where I was doing crazy hours and, working around the clock. And someone said to me, Mike, nobody in the company in 20 years is going to remember who you were. But in 20 years, your friends and family are going to remember who you were.
This is true. Very true.
And, making sure that you put priorities right is critically important, because your friends and family are the ones who are going to be, with you as you're older. So Kamal Sharma often used to say, look after the people who will be at your funeral.
Yeah. Very true.
Don't forget that.
Very true.
I know it's a bit morbid. I don't want to end on that morbid note, but the point really is about, keeping life balanced is really important. And I've always been a believer in having fun along the way. And I think you can work hard and have fun at the same time. It's really important for me anyway. I like to have fun as I go.
And for me too. Me too. I want to end with just one thing, and it's something I picked up in the CEO magazine. You were on the front cover of that magazine back in 2017, and it quotes in the magazine itself that you were born to lead.
Oh,
and I've
had
the privileged opportunity to work with you before, and I've been able to see that firsthand, how amazing of a leader you are.
Thank you.
So I wanted to thank you for having a chat with me today on the Leadership Conversations podcast. And once again, it's been great to be able to do this in person with you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.